This episode of Bullet Heaven was made with a copy of the game provided by Two Awesome Studio. It's pretty much to the point that we can call the end of November and December in general Shmuppy Switchmas. In episode 189 of Bullet Heaven, we took a look at the first of many shooters on the Nintendo Switch to see release. Xenoraid was a choice, very high quality game that everyone should be playing, but what about the others? How do they measure up? Well,
Dimension Drive was a vertical tate style shoot 'em up with a twist. Originally developed for PC by Two Awesome Studios as an early access title, it would see official release on December 7th of 2017 to Windows, Mac, and Linux-based PCs and the Nintendo Switch in North America and Europe. Featuring a quote-unquote double-tate setup, players can switch between each half of the screen at will, which factors into a number of its gameplay mechanics. Let's take a closer look.
Dimension Drive is a game that plays very differently from most shooters out there. In fact, amongst those titles that feature a warp mechanic, Dimension Drive is easily the most innovative based on its core gameplay setup, by way of the player's ship known as the Manticore. In a lot of ways, it's a puzzle game before it's a shoot-'em-up, requiring players to use different unlocked abilities in specific areas to get through the game's stages in specific ways.
Players move their ship around the screen like any other vertical shooter. 8-way or analog controls get the job done exactly as you expect. A Dimension Drive ship has a satisfying rate of movement to it as well, falling right into the Goldilocks zone. Neither too fast nor too slow.
Shots are fired by way of the Y button on the Switch controller. There is no bomber, no special sub-weapons, just the main shot and that's it. But this is deceptively simple. When firing, a gauge at the top of the screen will deplete until no power remains. Each side of the screen has its own gauge, and the opposite gauge from the player's position will recharge gradually. Picking up green power drops from fallen enemies will recharge this gauge as well.
Dimension Drive has a few special mechanics that make the game uniquely complex and engaging. First up is the switch function. As the players move about their half of the screen, a cursor will move in tandem with them on the other half. Pressing the A button on the Joy-Con will instantly transport the player to the other half of the screen. The player should take care. It's extremely easy to misjudge movement when trying to find a good place to warp, especially since both sides are asymmetrical. This will often end in instant death through obstacle collision. Some areas are only accessible through warping as well, which can be both challenging and rewarding.
Other abilities open up as the game is further completed as well. A reverse drive allows for players to flip their shot upside down to shoot towards the bottom of the screen, activated by the X button. This technique will also slow the scrolling of the stage to a crawl, allowing players more time to navigate some of the trickier segments. Finally, the drift drive, activated by the B button, lets players phase quickly through narrow barriers either to the left or the right of the Manticore. Typically, this technique is used to grab power-ups with more certainty than a dimensional shift, but the drift can also be used to defeat smaller enemies. These extra abilities can also be used when taking on earlier missions for score and rank attack.
Along the way, data cubes can be collected to unlock new weapons. The more the player has, the better. The first of the 3 locked weapons is unlocked at 10 data cubes, the second at 20, and the last at 30. Some data cubes are pretty challenging to snap up, often requiring perfect timing and careful planning. Some cubes are hidden though, requiring players to fulfill special conditions to obtain them. Obviously, the more the better, since unlocked weapons are available when rerunning previous stages for scores.
Enemy ships make for quite the hazard when warping as well. Finding just the right place to warp in and out of can be tricky when contending with several enemy waves on both sides of the screen. Likewise, some enemy attack patterns, especially those of bosses, can only be avoided with careful timing and positioning when using the dimensional shift. Players have a shield stock for each of their lives though, so enemy and bullet collision doesn't mean instant destruction like flying into walls and static obstacles. Shield pickups scattered throughout each stage can recharge the player's defensive stock if they are damaged.
Dimension Drive is played over the course of 3 main areas with a total of 13 stages, grouped 4, and in the case of the third area 5, at a time. Each stage is broken up into a number of checkpoints and is completed after a boss encounter, either by way of a giant stage and craft or a high-speed gauntlet. Dimension Drive is also fairly heavy in terms of story, but not in an overbearing way. Players actually have the option to turn the story totally off to focus solely on the gameplay. All 13 stages are also playable mirrored in a new Game Plus style unlockable mode when the game is beaten.
Dimension Drive also features 2-player co-op as well. All of the features that play in the single-player game translate over to multiplayer. In the case of power-ups, if one player collects a power-up pickup, both players get enhancements. Same goes for armor. But there's one main issue with the system. Players share both armor stocks and lives. Not a huge issue in terms of armor since it can be recovered with pickups. But death also counts for both players at once, and it's worse than it sounds. When one player dies, both die at the same time, throwing both back to the previous checkpoint. Yikes. Weapon power is also drained away extremely fast and can be challenging to recover efficiently.
This will definitely cause frustration. We're sure that some players out there will appreciate this needlessly hard mechanic to multiplayer, but we prefer the games that don't penalize the players that are actually making progress and, don't actually die. This kind of setup only really benefits a pair of players that isn't easily distracted by the other player's ship, is equally as skilled, and, barring these two factors, players that both have a ton of patience with the other if they mess up. It also doesn't help that enemies are way more difficult to kill. Yes, even the popcorn ones.
Because that's the main takeaway here. It's way too easy to f shit up for the player, or in general, really. Dimension Drive is a very fresh idea in the realm of vertical shooters with very sound, novel concepts. On paper. But in practice, the asymmetrical stage habs and fire patterns make for a very frustrating ordeal on the whole. A lot, and we mean a lot, of memorization is going to be required to get the best ranks in Dimension Drive throughout the whole game. Something that players may or may not want to be hassled with. Add to that some stage obstacles that aren't especially well defined or visible, which leads to death after death, and things can get pretty iffy on the whole.
As simple as the controls are, we never really came to grips with them in the 10 hours we spent in Dimension Drive. Granted, we knew where everything was and how it worked on the controller, but when it came down to the wire, especially in the quick-moving boss segments that sometimes require reactions in the 10th of a second, we'd consistently trip at what needed to be used where, and just ended up biting it over and over and over again. The setup is just ever so slightly unintuitive. The only real solution? Engage vertical drive to slow the stages to a crawl. If an option existed for remapping some of the controls, maybe say to the shoulder buttons, this might be a non-issue.
But again, Dimension Drive is very puzzle-oriented in a lot of ways too, so the more a player sticks with it, the better, in theory, they should become. There's less dynamic on-your-feet thinking here and more of a trial-and-error setup. With practice, players should be able to learn the exact places to be and what techniques to use to streamline their progress and maximize their scoring.
But for those looking to bump the challenge up, 3 additional difficulty levels change how many lives, shields, and checkpoints exist within the game. Hard, extreme, and insane levels exist, but for us, normal was enough.
Just like the stage progression in Dimension Drive, the scoring is achieved on a stage-by-stage basis. The scoring in Dimension Drive is pretty simple stuff. As players defeat enemies, a multiplier will build that adds more points to the player's total with more kills. The multiplier can be built all the way up to 99 times, but if a player is hit, the multiplier will be lost and must be built up again from 1 times. There isn't much more to it in the stages themselves, but knowing where to use the Manticore's ability to kill as many enemies as possible without getting hit and losing the multiplier is critical in getting as many points as possible.
At stage end, players will receive bonus points for the amount of data cubes collected, the amount of player ships remaining, and how few times the computer lets you know that you're low on energy. In the case of energy warnings, it's advisable not to go in guns blazing, instead shooting only when stuff appears or is anticipated to appear on screen and collecting as much energy as possible.
Finally, a letter rank is applied to the stage in question when everything is tallied up. But there are serious issues with these letter ranks. First off, there can be times when a perfect stage play is achieved, and what does a player get? C. Other times we got killed several times, missed data cubes, and had over 10 energy warnings, only to get an A.
But the biggest issue of all is that no matter what letter rank you get, all that will be shown on any stage regardless of grade is C. This issue makes Dimension Drive 100% pointless in terms of playing for letter rank and, by extension, score. It leaves only survival behind, which is sure to turn off players looking to even try scoring high until it gets fixed.
Beyond all of this, with no online leaderboards, the scoring takes a firm backseat behind survival and storytelling, which could limit the appeal of Dimension Drive in the end.
Shield.
So with memorization-based gameplay and functional yet broken scoring, how does Dimension Drive hold up on the presentation end of things? Not too bad, actually. In addition to decent audiovisual chops, there's a lot to unlock by way of data cube collection to fully flesh out the story in the game, which is pretty well written.
Well written, that is, outside of the numerous typos found in the actual text of the game. This would be a pretty easy fix via patches, but it was pretty jarring to see so many mistakes in the text. The story is a tad cliché in most respects, but it's functional to the kind of action that takes place in the game.
Visually, Dimension Drive is solid with polygonal models and dynamic lighting, making for a decent graphical presentation. Enemy shots and lasers are easy to see, and there's a good amount of detail to everything on screen. But where everything else is visible enough, it should be noted that there is also a collision warning indicator that tells players when they will warp into an obstacle, but it's super difficult to see. There's also a decent bit of slowdown in places as well, and even, mysteriously, in the menus. It seems to get worse the longer the game is played, which is a bit odd.
The overall design to the ships and characters is pretty good though. Some of the story scenes are a little simplistic when it comes to the backdrops, but the alien races look pretty cool, and the ships, especially the Manicore, are neat. It is kind of obvious, though, that the main focus in terms of overall design is Jack herself. The main complaint against the visuals are, once again, that some stage portions that result in insta-death collisions look like backgrounds and vice versa.
There is also sometimes some flickery graphical issues and a strange tearing effect on the title screen. But the sound design is solid. Every single stage has a unique theme, which is uncommon for a game that has so many stages. Each track gives its respective stage a good overall feel in terms of sound, and while the tunes may not stand apart from each other especially well, they're still all pretty good overall.
A good UI and clean interface also means players can navigate the game easily, and basic options exist for players to customize their sound and gameplay experience. So how does Dimension Drive stack up? Let's take a look.
Low energy. Low energy.
Dimension Drive's control is great when it comes to the Manticore's solid movement.
But while the dimension shift works well, it gets overcomplicated with the vertical and drift drives.
On the outset, it seems as if Dimension Drive has a high rate of challenge.
But in the end, outside of the boss ships, it's less on the fly skill and more memorization.
With 13 stages over 3 areas, all of which are mirrored, there's a decent amount of gameplay to the main scenario.
But outside of the unlockable data cube bonuses, replay is limited thanks to busted score ranks and a lack of online leaderboards.
The solid polygon engine that Dimension Drive sports is nice, but slowdown often occurs, even in the menus.
The character and ship designs look great. Flickery, clippy graphical issues are common though.
In terms of sound, unique tracks for every stage make for a great soundtrack, but it all sounds very similar.
VO is delivered well, and sound effects are fitting and well implemented.
On paper, Dimension Drive is as ingenious as it comes, but something just doesn't add up in practice, and we're not really sure why.
This kind of game is pretty terrible for multiplayer though. The inclusion of a co-op mode is commendable, but it falls pretty flat the way it currently works.
At about $13 there's a decent amount of game to Dimension Drive, even if it might be a little limited.
The mirrored stages make for a total of 26 stages, so $13 isn't bad at all.
So, Dimension Drive, briefly summed up, an excellent concept, but ever so iffy on execution. It has a great system at play, but the way it all comes together feels a little less great than we'd hoped. We could see sticking with the game for scoring, but with ranking in an unworkable, non-online state, for now. The 26 stages in Dimension Drive offers only a mildly fun quest for survival. On the whole though, Dimension Drive gets a 3.5 out of 5. You can get a copy of Dimension Drive for Nintendo Switch for about $13 or on Steam for about $12. This one had a whole heap of potential. I think if button mapping were added, it might be miles better.
I agree. I'm kinda sad that this one fell flatter than expected.
I hear that there are some things being added later down the line. Maybe some of our suggestions will make it in. It wouldn't be the first time.